Guys, there's been plenty of lost media in animation over the years, so much so that it's basically its own genre. But nothing has been considered more of a Bigfoot than the original pilot for Avatar the Last Airbender. It had been referenced, in fact, very heavily in the behind-the-scenes documentary Avatar Spirits.
Produce a pilot.
You gotta make a pilot. We finished the pilot.
The intention of a pilot.
The pilot, we did this 12-minute pilot.
However, despite a 3-season run and a whole other sequel series, we had never gotten to see the original pilot until now. That's right, with all of the recent Avatar hype and the fact that they have their own official YouTube channel now, Nickelodeon finally released the long-demanded original Avatar pilot, and it's different. It's definitely a half-baked version of the show, with all the characters we know and love acting a teensy bit different. So I think it'd be interesting to take a look at this pilot and really analyze the differences, and try to figure out how this show changed from this version to the final, along with what aspects stayed the same. After all, this pilot was a huge success, and it was enough to get the show greenlit. So without further ado, let's break this thing down. Now, the first thing that survived the initial jump from pilot to television series is the opening we all know and love, still narrated by Katara.
My grandmother used to tell me stories about the old days, how the four nations once lived in harmony, how everything changed once the Fire Nation attacked. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the old days, a time of peace, but that all changed when the Fire Nation attacked.
I swear to God, until the Fire Nation attacked is a phrase that's tattooed in the brains of an entire generation. The format is still the same, going through the 4 types of bending, except instead of slick silhouettes, we see members of each nation in their own environment. This was probably to help establish the 4 nations, their dress, look, fighting style, and environment for a first-time audience. More specifically, the executives who were directly in control of the series getting greenlit. It feels way more exposition-y than the final theme song, so I'd say it accomplished its job. Finally, getting to the pilot itself, we open with Team Avatar on Appa, already established as a group, in heated pursuit by Prince Zuko. A classic Avatar situation. Right off the bat, you can tell that everyone is sort of a caricatured version of themselves. An arguably needed decision when you only have so much time to get the big guys on board with the series. You need to highlight the dominant traits of the characters, and unfortunately sacrifice some of the subtleties and nuance. In fact, even the group dynamic is different, which is something we'll touch on later. Aang, for instance, appears to be way more goofy and fun-loving in the face of danger. While he was known to cut loose around the enemies in the series, he knew when to buckle down and get serious, saving his lighthearted tendencies for after the fighting. Also, it's important to mention, Aang totally has a different voice actor. It's subtle, but you can definitely tell.
Let's go swimming before Sokka gets back.
Will you go penguin sledding with me?
I'm the Avatar, silly!
Aang definitely feels more like the little kid of the group here, something that doesn't quite translate into the full series. And I'ma just be real, he's a little more annoying in this version. Whereas in the final version, he felt more naive. In the pilot, he comes off as more immature, if that makes sense. Oh yeah, and Katara is Kaya for some reason. I don't know why, I couldn't find a reason, so I guess just roll with it. Katara is a way better name anyways. I'm really glad they changed this in the final version. I don't know how, but I blame M. Night. Speaking of Katara, or Kaya, she's a lot more stubborn in the pilot and is almost more controlling of Aang. Although understandably so. I mean, he's literally the Avatar. Kaya has trouble waterbending in the pilot, which allows for Aang to give her a pretty rudimentary explanation of bending, i.e. pilot exposition. But this is still interesting as it makes you wonder if Aang's journey of mastering all 4 elements would have been different if he's the one trying to teach Kaya. As we all know, in season 1, it was all about Aang having to learn waterbending from Katara. Speaking of the two, the will they won't they of Aang and Katara is played up way more obviously, at least on Aang's end. It's honestly more of a super obvious crush that Aang has.
You're way too important.
You're important too. To me.
Moving on to the 3rd member of Team Avatar, Sokka is not as fun in this pilot as he is in the series. In fact, he's a lot more argumentative. Sokka still has a stigma for waterbending, something he had in episode 1, but like never again in the series, and he often butts heads with Aang, the two having a pretty heated argument in the pilot. In fact, he calls him Air Boy. Like, damn, that just sounds really derogatory. We'll touch more on this later, but these are just the first impressions of Team Avatar when you watch the pilot. Moving on to the series' first villain, Zuko is the main villain of the pilot, and honestly, he is way more dramatic, especially in Dante Bosco's delivery. Even more intense than Zuko already was, but in a Saturday morning cartoon villain way.
Improve your firebending or you're swimming home in your armor.
Also, Zuko has a bird companion, which we'll touch on later, because it's awesome. After surviving an initial encounter with Zuko and escaping to an island, Sokka goes off to find food, but sadly gets caught by the Fire Nation, who happen to be building a base on the island. This version of the Fire Nation seems to be pretty much the same with some slight differences. It looks like they're not as developed in taking over the world as they are in the final series, although they could just be building a brand new base on this island. And also their costumes are different, which is something we'll talk about in a minute. But yeah, the term half-baked really kind of applies here. Eventually back at camp, Aang and Kaya realize Sokka's been missing for a while. After a super sick hang gliding sequence, they discover the Fire Nation base and in turn Sokka captured and being taken inside. Aang's first impression is to go in and save him, but Kaya has to remind him that he has to stay back because he's too important to lose. He's literally the Avatar. Which she has a point, but this really plays into the fact that she really acts like she's in charge of Aang in the pilot, sort of bossing him around. Granted, for his own good, but still this is way different from their dynamic in the full series.
You're the Avatar. Start acting like it.
Inside the Fire Nation base, it's revealed that they totally killed the serpent from earlier, which is terrifying. And there's something about this death that I can't quite put my foot on that feels just more prominent and forward than the deaths in the main series. It definitely makes the Fire Nation a little bit scarier.
Did Jet just die?
You know, it was really unclear.
Despite Kaya's warnings, Aang ends up going in to save them because he's still heroic yet in over his head a bit. Once Aang's in the base, it's a classic Avatar fight sequence, complete with bumping flute music and banging drums. Fun fact, most of the music from this pilot made it over into the full series, which is why it just sounds so familiar. The pilot comes to a head with Aang and Zuko having a showdown on some scaffolding, which is honestly a pretty intense sequence. In fact, the scaffolding fight idea ended up carrying over into the main series too, which just shows how influential this original pilot was, and how many ideas they had laid out from the beginning. This is the first real bending fight we see besides the opening, and there's a couple of things I want to point out that I love about this sequence. One thing for certain is the fact that firebenders literally have to use hoses to put out their fires, like that's just really funny to me. But it's not enough sadly, and in their fight, Zuko completely destroys his own scaffolding, which is honestly just a massive L for them.
My scaffolding! My precious scaffolding!
He does whip out the fire knives though, which is pretty sick, and when all hope is lost and his back is against the wall, and it looks like Zuko's about to win, Aang pulls his trump card and goes into the Avatar state on command. In fact, he does it in almost a cocky way. He uses the Avatar state to absolutely murk Zuko, so it was definitely worth it. Meanwhile, Kaya and Sokka have their own little moment where Kaya uses waterbending to escape, and the three manage to escape and fly away on Aang's glider, giving us the weirdest final shot where Aang boasts, "You're flying with the Avatar," as Kaya is literally weeping in fear. I don't really like this Aang. Anyways, the pilot ends with them all flying safely away on Appa into the night, with Kaya's narration closing out the whole thing. And there you have it, guys. That was the until now lost Avatar pilot. It's a quick little Avatar adventure that quite honestly delivers everything it needed to. It established the world, characters, rules, and conflicts, all paired with a crazy cool scaffolding fight. I'm not surprised, but Avatar really gave us an incredible pilot. If I was a kid in the test audience, or an executive at Nickelodeon, I would be stupid not to greenlight this. And of course, we all know how that story turned out, but still, it cannot be denied that there are tons of differences here, some that deserve a little bit more of a breakdown. So to close out this video, let's take a look at the main differences between this pilot and the original series. The first thing I want to touch on is the general look and design. The thing that struck me the most, despite how beautiful this animation was just how slightly off this version looked. From the designs to the color choices, it's great, but it's just not quite the Avatar that we got. And that's for plenty of reasons, the biggest probably being that pilots are produced completely separate from the production of season 1. They weren't just trying to make one episode of Avatar, it was meant to be a proof of concept. Think of it as like a short film they have to use to pitch the whole show. And overall, the pilot is still beautiful, besides a few moments where characters look a little wonky, and it definitely set a precedent from the very beginning that Avatar was going to look very different from most cartoons at the time, down to just how much work they put into the visuals. Now let's talk about Kaya. There's not much to say here. Katara was originally named Kaya, and yeah, it was weird. I can't find a specific reason why they changed it, and honestly, it probably isn't very groundbreaking. Name changes are super common from concept to pilot to final product, but that being said, if you have any idea, let us know in those comments down below. I'd love to know. Now let's talk about my favorite part of the pilot, Zuko's bird, and my least favorite part, no Uncle Iroh. Zuko had a bird. Well, a hawk to be exact. But why did they change this? Where did his bird go? That's right, Aang wasn't the only one with an animal companion. In fact, this bird almost feels like the antithesis to Momo. In the pilot, they have their own little battle, and it plays on the fact that Aang and Zuko are foils of each other. So honestly, this hawk would have been a welcomed addition to the main series, and I'm sure they always wanted to give Zuko an animal companion. But likewise, interestingly enough, in this version there's no Uncle Iroh, at least not in this story. I'm not sure if he was just too complicated of a character to try to squeeze in, or if they wanted to make it less crowded in terms of characters they were introducing so as not to overwhelm the audience, but everyone's favorite jolly uncle is missing from the pilot. This makes me wonder, was this bird the original Uncle Iroh? Not in terms of character, but in terms of companionship to Zuko. Possibly, but obviously not in a direct way. It would have been trippy if this bird was spitting wisdom. Still, as sad as I am to see this bird gone, you cannot beat Uncle Iroh as a character. He went on to become one of the most legendary Avatar characters of all time, not to mention literally the moral compass of like an entire generation of kids, myself included. Still, it makes me wonder how different the series would have been if Zuko had his bird pal. Maybe he would have been less angry, but probably not. Now let's talk about Aang's behavior. I've touched on it a lot in this video, but I want to get into more specifics because this one is less obvious, but definitely worth mentioning. Aang may be a 100-year-old kid, but in the series, he strived to be mature for his age, due to being raised by air nomads, even if he had impulses and childish tendencies, like continuously trying to impress Katara at the wrong moments. I mean, remember that kiss before the finale? Despite the fun-loving nature of being an airbender, when stuff got real, he knew he had to deal with it. But in the pilot, they didn't quite have that balance down yet. One of the biggest problems of the show was that Aang was just a kid despite being the literal savior of the world, and I think they just had to play that up for the pilot. From the opening scene where he treated the aerial flight with the firebenders like a fun game, to his fight with Zuko at the end, this version of Aang was goofing off. He also seemed a little cockier, something that did not carry over into the final show. He definitely seems more proud to be the Avatar, which would have been a really interesting angle if it had made it to the final show, as Aang started out resenting his role as the Avatar and doubting himself. Meanwhile, it was Korra who would go on to be boastful of her status until her shortcomings wore her down. Overall, this version of Aang is arguably not as likable, but they had to get the point across, and more so, probably misled the direction of Aang's character to make him feel like other protagonists on the network at the time, like Timmy Turner or Danny Phantom, characters who are quippy and having huge moments of immaturity. It's important to take everything in this pilot with a grain of salt because it is a pilot. And finally, let's talk about character dynamics. This is another big thing that people point out about the pilot, from Sokka being less goofy and more stubborn, to Katara/Kaya being more bossy in terms of how she holds the three of them together. They definitely have way more conflict between them. This sort of carries over into the pilot, but as the series went on, the conflict around them got so real that they never really had to argue like that. Instead, they're kind of depending on each other to work together. Sure, they have their funny moments, but the Team Avatar in the final series definitely seems more like a team that wants to be together than a team that is forced to be like it is in the pilot. And finally, let's talk about the Avatar state. The Avatar state is way different in this version than initially in the original series. Yes, it's every Avatar's final move to go into the Avatar state, where they basically go beast mode and can access the strengths of every previous Avatar. But originally in the series, it was always something that Aang went into almost unwillingly, without control, triggered by something heavy emotionally, like seeing his dead father figure. However, in the pilot, it looks like he knows exactly how to use it, and in fact does so to finally take down Zuko. I'm glad they made it a little more complicated in the final series, and it definitely made the Avatar state way more dramatic than it appears in this pilot, but again, it's the pilot, and they had to fit a lot into a short time frame, so I can't really fault them here. It's just definitely different. And I guess that's what I'd say about this entire pilot. There were some differences, but a lot of it was the same. And honestly, it was just such an interesting watch, seeing the first iteration of one of the most influential cartoons of all time. I'm glad it's finally out. I will definitely be rewatching this a ton of times, just for the novelty of it, but that's all we really have to say about the original Avatar pilot. But that being said, I'd love to hear what you guys think. Did you like this pilot? Did you not? Is there something we missed? Let us know in those comments down below, or tweet to us at Roundtable Vids or me at @RetroNemo. As always, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like, share it, and subscribe to the Roundtable for more incredible cartoon content. As always, guys, I'm Nemo. This is an Avatar video, and I will see you next time. Peace.